Right, so in today's lesson, we are going to look at basically the nervous system. So the nervous system falls under a big umbrella division called the human response to the environment. And in today's lesson, we are only going to look at one segment of that, known as the nervous system. And in class, you will also be looking at the eye and the ear. Right, so let's get into our lesson today. So, as I mentioned, there are three sections in this chapter: the nervous system, the eye, as well as the ear. And we are, however, only going to focus on the nervous system today. So, there are some changes within our environment, whether that is internal or external, and those changes must be observed by your body. So there are some receptors that will detect these changes, and then our body needs to react to those changes. Right, and we are going to specifically have a look at how the nervous system detect and then bring about some change. There is also another system that also controls some of these changes, and that is the endocrine system, and you will have to wait until next week when we discuss how that manages all of our body's functions. So within, just to sort of give us a difference between these two systems, the nervous system both of them works with messages. So messages needs to be conveyed to the nervous system and then move to a muscle or to a gland. But the nervous system's messages are conveyed by an electrical impulse. Right, so that is today's focus. However, the endocrine system also works with messages, but these messages are chemical messages, and they come in the form of hormones, and they will then go to a target organ to also bring about a change. Alright, so within this nervous, we're going to start off with our nervous system, and Ms. Boyens is going to take it up from here.
Okay, so when we look at the nervous system, it has three components. There we go. It has three components. So we have the sensory input, which then be our receptors in our body that can then detect this change in the environment, whether it's internal or external. So there will usually be a change in the environment. The temperature will rise, or there will be an increase in light intensity or a decrease in light intensity. And that sensory input will then be conveyed to the nervous system that will then integrate this information. And then it will decide, I'm going to react to that information or I'm not going to react to that information. Some information in our body doesn't cause our nervous system to react. For instance, you can always see the edge of your nose, but you don't see it. Okay, it's always in your field of view, but when you look at something else, that your brain is actually cutting out that information. It's deciding that it is not important. It's at the bottom of what is important and what you need to know at that point. So your body is integrating that information, and then it's deciding to react. And if it's reacting, it will send a message back to the body. Now, we can have two different ways how the body reacts. It can either be sent to, we call it an effector, and that can either be a gland or a muscle that then will react to the information that comes from our integration unit, which is the brain. Okay, so how does our body detect a change, for instance, in the environment? This is where our five sense organs come into play. So we can see here our eyes, our mouth, specifically our tongue in our mouth, our ears, our nose, and in our skin. We've got different types of receptors that are able then to continuously monitor the external environment and send messages to our central nervous system that then can interpret that messages and decide if an action is necessary. Ooh, sorry. Okay. The nervous system can be then subdivided into two main systems, or two separate sections, if you want to call it that. We call it the central nervous system, and you may use the abbreviation CNS, and then the other section is our peripheral nervous system. And we are going to look in detail now how these two sections is subdivided, okay, because not all of them are included under each heading. So if we go look at our nervous system, I already said that we have the central nervous system and we've got the peripheral nervous system here. The central nervous system is if I always think it's like an axis in the middle of our body. So if I look at you, your brain and your spinal cord, that part is known as my central nervous system. And everything outside of that is known as the peripheral nervous system. And that consists out of different nerves that goes into the central nervous system, and then nerves that leave the central nervous system. And then therefore we can subdivide them into two sections. Those that carries impulses towards the nervous system, the central nervous system, is known as my sensory neurons, and then those that carry impulses away from the central nervous system is known as my motor neurons. Motor neurons, depending on what type of reaction they bring about, can then be classified as my somatic nervous system and my autonomic nervous system. Somatic, usually to the cells, okay, to the normal muscle functions, if I can call it like that, to your skeletal muscles, okay. And my autonomic nervous system is those ones that you don't think about, okay. It happens automatically, okay. And my sympathetic will increase that. It's usually a stimulating effect, and a parasympathetic, it's like pressing the petrol. It increases usually, not always, there is exceptions, but it is enhancing the effect. And parasympathetic is like pressing the brake. It's slowing it down, going back to normal. Okay, so if we continue with that, we can see here the difference between the parasympathetic and the sympathetic nervous system. The sympathetic nervous system will be activated usually in a flight or fight reaction, for instance. So it will increase your heart rate. It will increase breathing, okay? It will dilate your pupils, okay? So that you can run away and that you are able to see better. And after the lion has now chased you and you're finally safe, now the body has to go back to normal. And that is when the parasympathetic nervous system kicks in. So the pupils will contract, the heart rate will slow down, okay? My breathing will go back to the regular rate that it was before I activated my sympathetic nervous system. So it is important to know, you don't need to know all of these functions of each one, but I presume in your textbook there will be 3 or 4 of the functions of the parasympathetic nervous system and functions of the sympathetic nervous system. So you have to be able to know what is going to happen if the sympathetic nervous system is activated and what is going to happen if the parasympathetic nervous system is activated. Okay, so
right,
Ms. Monica is now going over to the peripheral nervous system.
So just to quickly go back to this flow diagram, I am going to take us through the peripheral nervous system. And that is basically all of your nerves, right? So all of your nerves that extend from your spinal cord, if you can sort of imagine this line here, and all of the nerves that branches out from your spinal cord, as well as the nerves that will go to and from your brain. All of that will make up your peripheral nervous system, right? So looking at this image here, all of the nerves extending down your spinal cord, those are called spinal nerves, and all of the nerves that basically comes to and from your brain, those would be cranial nerves, and together that makes up your peripheral nervous system. So just a few sort of facts. I mentioned the cranial nerves, I mentioned the spinal nerves, and there's many pairs of each, so 12 pairs of cranial nerves, 31 pairs of spinal nerves, and these nerves consist out of cells that we call neurons. Right. So a neuron is basically a nerve cell, and we are going to have a look at what a neuron looks like. So I am going to draw here 3 types of neurons, just based on what they physically look like. So on the furthest left, here we have a neuron known as a monopolar neuron. Mono refers to one. So there's a cell, and we'll have a look at the different parts of the neuron and the neurons and their names. But this cell there with the nucleus, this is called the cell body, and it only has one outgrowth fiber, or a fiber that extends from there. So therefore we call it a monopolar neuron. A bipolar neuron, bi refers to 2, and here there are these 2 fibers that extend from that center cell, that cell body. And then a multipolar neuron, multi obviously refers to many, so then there are many of these outgrowths and many fibers that extend from and to the cell body. So that is just how we classify neurons, based on what they look like. So based on what their structure is, we don't know what their function is yet. So based on their function, we can also classify them into 3 types. One is called a sensory neuron, and a sensory neuron will sense what is happening. Right, so it says a receptor. So a sensory neuron will take the message, and in this case with the nervous system, we call messages impulses. So it is going to take that impulse and take it to the brain, and take it to the spinal cord, so that the brain and spinal cord can now make a decision in terms of what they need to do. So sensory neuron senses what is happening and takes the message to the brain. The motor neuron, however, will now convey this impulse from the central nervous system and take the message to a muscle or to a gland to bring about a type of a response, a motor response. So a motor neuron, it has this shape. It looks like a multipolar neuron with all these many dendrites that extend from it. And this one in the middle, some textbooks refer to it as an interneuron or a connector neuron, and it is literally just between these 2 neurons. So this is the neuron that relays the information. It connects the sensory with the motor neuron, and therefore we call this an interneuron. And about at the end of today's lesson, we'll have a look at something called the reflex arc, where we will bring all 3 of these neurons together in one big picture, so that you can have a clear idea of what they all do. Right, so as part of your sort of guidelines, you need to be able to draw a neuron. So starting with the drawing, your drawing always has a heading, and in this case I'm making my heading a neuron. Right, so my drawing has the following features. There's this circular part that looks like a cell, and we call that the cell body. Right, then coming out from the cell, there's a fiber, and usually they should indicate in the direction where the message is going. So this message will be going downward, and therefore we call this the axon. Right, and a motor neuron, in this case, it's a motor neuron. It has many, or multipolar neuron, it has many of these outgrowths. The axon, there's always only one axon. And then these outgrowths there at the top, those are then called dendrites, and they will convey the impulse to the cell body. Right, so there we have just a few extra labels. Then you can see that our axon, so that fiber in the middle is the axon, and it is covered with a layer. It has a little jacket on, and that jacket is called the myelin sheath. Right, so that myelin sheath is quite important, as it speeds up the impulse, so the impulse can quickly move through to the next neuron, and it insulates the axon so that impulse will be transmitted very quickly. So then just looking at our labels, there we have a dendrite, but there are actually 5 dendrites on this neuron. Right, so each one of them is a dendrite, and you can sort of imagine me drawing an arrow pointing to the cell body. So the impulse is going to move in this direction from the dendrite to the cell body. So that would be this middle part. Altogether, it's called the cell body, and it consists out of the cytoplasm. It has a nucleus, it has a cell membrane, and together the cell body. So our impulse moves from the dendrite to the cell body, and then our impulse needs to be conveyed through the axon. Right, so sort of A for away, the axon will convey the impulse away from the cell body, and then this layer that surrounds my axon, we call that the myelin sheath, and it's a very important role as it insulates and speeds up the transmission of my impulse. So let's quickly look at a question based on the structure of a neuron. Oh, and then of course we have the sort of the end tip of my axon, and it is then called the nerve terminal. All right.
Okay, so this is a very typical question in the exam, where they give us a picture of a neuron, and they give us labels A, B, and C, and then they ask us questions on this diagram. So the first question they ask is identify the type of neuron represented in the diagram. You will never use multipolar, monopolar, or bipolar or unipolar, because those aren't in your syllabus. So that was just for you to see that there's a difference in structure of the different types of neurons we get. But what you must be able to do is you have to be able to identify if it's a motor neuron, a sensory neuron, or an interneuron. Okay, so in this case, this is a motor neuron because we can see that there's multiple dendrites coming into this cell body. Okay, if it was a sensory neuron, we would only have one fiber that connects to the cell body. So identify the type of neuron represented in this diagram. That will then be a motor neuron due to the fact that there is multiple fibers. That's how I remember it. Motor is multiple fibers coming to the cell body. Okay, then question 2, state one function of part B, and this is also important. The action, okay, so part B, we must first go identify what is part B. So that is the long fiber extending away from the cell body. So the axon transports impulses away from the cell body. Okay, state one function. So you don't have to explain how it works, you can just give a short answer. Then question 3, explain the role of part C in the functioning of the neuron. Explain means that my answer has to be cause and effect. So explain the role of part C. So what is part C? It's that little jacket that Miss Monica referred to. It's actually a layer of fat cells that is rolled up like a cigar almost around this axon, and it's a fat layer that insulates the axon. Okay, and what that does, it increases the speed at which the impulse then can be conducted through the axon. Okay, so what is the function? So explain the role. The myelin sheath insulates the axon, and what is the cause, the effect of that insulation? It increases the speed of conduction. So there you can see cause and effect. It insulates, and then it increases the speed of conduction. Okay, then question 4, explain this consequence for a reflex action if the neuron shown in the diagram is damaged. Okay, so where am I going to find this neuron? This neuron will be from the brain to the body. Remember, we said that the motor neurons occur, they send messages from the central nervous system to the body. So what happens if this is damaged? The person will then be able to actually feel, for instance, if he's touching a hot plate, he will feel there will be a neuron, the sensory neuron, that will take a message to the central nervous system, but the brain will not be able to send a message to the muscle for you to pull away your hand. So explain, so it has to be cause and effect. So if the motor neuron is damaged, an impulse will reach the central nervous system from the receptor, but no impulse will be able to reach the effector, which is my muscle or my gland, from the central nervous system. Therefore, no reaction will take place. Okay. Rather write a little bit more and make sure that you include all the little sections, because, for instance, in this paper, this question counted 2 marks, but it could easily have counted 3 marks. So rather write a little bit more and make sure that you have all the different components of that action. So the message can come from the body to the brain, it can feel the pain, but it cannot send a message to the muscle, and therefore there is no reaction. So the person cannot pull away from the pain on his finger. Okay. So the central nervous system, we've talked a lot about it, and there's a little diagram. So that includes my brain and then the spinal cord. Remember, the spinal cord is actually not the vertebral column. That's something different, okay? That's the bones that actually surrounds the spinal cord. So the spinal cord is a band of nerve tissue that is found inside the vertebral column, okay? The bones around it is there to protect my spinal cord. So my spinal cord is actually nerves, it's not bone, and many people get confused because they refer to the vertebral column, but your spinal cord is not your the vertebra itself is actually not part of your nervous system, it's part of your skeletal system. So it's 2 different systems that you're referring to. Okay, so how is the brain protected? I've got a little video here that shows us the different parts. So the skin of your scalp, on top of your skull is the skin, and then just below that we have the bone of your skull, and then we actually have 3 different membranes that surrounds your brain. We call them the meninges. You aren't supposed to know, or it's not compulsory for you to know the 3 different types of meninges. You can call them the collective name, which is known as the meninges, but just for interest's sake, there is actually 3 different ones. And we then find a fluid in between these membranes, which we call the cerebrospinal fluid. And that cerebrospinal fluid is actually very, very important for the functioning of your brain. So the brain is protected by the skin, the skull, or the bone of the skull's bone, and then the 3 membranes, which we call the meninges, and then the cerebrospinal fluid, which we find between those membranes. Okay, so the spinal cord is protected by the vertebra, those bones that surround it that I just referred to. Okay, and they extend from the bottom of your skull right down to your pelvis. Okay, so there's a column in the form of a S shape to help you balance actually, that extends from your skull right down to your pelvis. Okay, and then it is also protected by the same meninges that is protecting your brain. They are linked or connected. They aren't separate membranes. They are continuous from your brain right down into your spinal column. They extend. If they actually do a lumbar puncture, they push a needle into that little space. So if you look there, there's your dura mater, and between your dura mater and your arachnoid membrane, there is cerebrospinal fluid, and then they push that needle into that space, and then they pull the spinal fluid or the cerebrospinal fluid from that space between the membranes. And then the last one we have is then the cerebrospinal fluid that also, you can see in this diagram that it is continuous, so it surrounds the brain there at the top, and it extends right down into your spine surrounding the spinal column. So this is then the fluid, and it acts as a shock absorber. So why do we need the cerebrospinal fluid? The most important one is it acts as a shock absorber. It's like a little egg in an egg, okay? So if I take an egg and I put it in a glass of water and I shake it, then the egg is going to take a long time to break, okay? Because the water is a buffer between the glass and the shell of the egg. So it acts as a shock absorber for the force that I'm exerting on it. So that is exactly what the cerebrospinal fluid is doing. It is a shock absorber. It surrounds your brain, so when you bump it, then the brain is not hitting the bone directly. There's a little bit of fluid, like a cushion, between your soft, very soft brain and the very hard skull. Okay, so it's important so that it acts as a shock absorber. And that is actually what happens when we have a concussion. Okay, when we have a concussion, your brain actually makes contact with your skull. You hit it hard enough that the brain actually goes through your cerebrospinal fluid and actually damages or shakes the inside of your head. Okay, your brain is a little bit shaken, and that's why it's called concussed. And actually, it can cause a brain bleed. If you can have a hard enough concussion, you can damage the top surface of your brain, and that is why it's so important that concussion is medically treated and looked after, because it can actually have severe consequences. Okay, then it also provides nutrients. It helps to transport, for instance, glucose and other nutrients towards all parts of the brain. And it removes waste, for instance, carbon dioxide, and then it regulates your pressure inside your brain. So, for instance, if you have a brain injury and it starts to swell, then that fluid can be drained or increased depending on. So it regulates the brain pressure that it's always the same constant level. But what happens if the brain swells too much because there's no space to expand beyond the skull? That is when we have a craniotomy, really big word, okay? But that is when they actually open up the skull to release the pressure of the brain. Okay, so you don't have to know that, that is just...
I think there are also some of those, that cerebrospinal fluid that leaks from the ear. If the pressure inside of the brain rises too much. To relieve that pressure, the fluid leaks out of
so it's actually, I love the brain, it's very interesting. It's one of my favorite topics. Okay, so this is now Miss Monica's part, the part where we talk about the different sections of the brain.
All right, so the brain, as being seen by this picture, you need to be able to label all of the, some of the parts, not all of them, and then also give some functions to them. So I'm going to start off by firstly just looking at each one of these separately. So there's the first one, the cerebrum. Then the second one is called the cerebellum. These two are words that are swapped around very often in exams. Cerebrum, and then we have the cerebellum. Then there's the corpus callosum, the medulla oblongata, and then the spinal cord. So those are the 5 parts that you need to identify and label. So the first part, the cerebrum, is this blue part indicated on the diagram, and the cerebrum is the largest part of the brain. And it is located at the front and at the top part of your skull, and it is then divided into a left and a right hemisphere. And this 4th bullet is then quite important, is that the white matter is on the inside and gray matter is on the outside. So if you have a look sort of at this picture here, so here they are showing you sort of an MRI from that shows you all these folds of the cerebrum, and there you can actually see that the white matter, so that is the area that is actually colored darker here, but this is the white matter, and it's supposed to be white. And then the dark matter or the gray matter is then on the outside of the cerebrum.
Just maybe explain what is the difference between white and gray matter, because we haven't included it.
Yes. So the white matter is the cell bodies. No, that's the gray matter. White matter is the axons with the fatty layer with the myelin sheath. That would be the white matter. So all of the axons that they accumulate on the inside of the cerebrum, and that is the white matter. And then the gray matter is all of the cell bodies that are then on the outside of the cerebrum. So the gray matter is made up of cell bodies, white matter is made up of the axons, and they make up the coloring of the cerebrum. Right. So here we have gray matter inside, white matter inside, gray matter outside, and then there are all of these grooves and folds, and the folds enlarges the surface area of the brain. So a few of the functions of the cerebrum. This is the largest part of the brain, so you can just imagine that it plays quite an important role in a variety of ways. It is involved in your behavior, in intelligence, memory, in movement. It also regulates hearing, memory, speech, language. It is there for memory, so all of the information that you have to remember today, your cerebrum has to allow that to happen. Your behavior and your personality, that is also based in your cerebrum. And then all voluntary movement, so the movement that you can control, that is regulated by your cerebrum.
I think also what is important to realize is that certain section, your cerebrum is also divided. You don't have to know the different sections, but what is important to realize is that in those sections there is very specific functions. For instance, if somebody gets a stroke, it can affect their speech and little or nothing else, and that is due to the fact where the stroke happened in their brain. So the different sections of the brain is very, very specialized in what parts of the body they are working with and functioning with. So when we talk about the cerebrum, we're talking about almost sensory input but all of those are actually subdivided into different sections. So it's very, very complex, and that's why neurologists get paid quite a lot.
Right, so we're looking at this, some of the additional information that you really don't have to go and study. You can see these different lobes. So the frontal lobe is responsible for behavior, intelligence, memory, movement. So like Ms. Boyan said, if you get, let's say, damage to the frontal lobe, then those would be the behaviors and functions that will be affected. The optical lobe here at the back of the brain, this one is responsible for vision, and this is why people getting hit at the back of their head could actually result in being blind or have some eye problems. So just to show you that the different parts of the cerebrum actually have a different function. Alright, so the next part is the corpus callosum. And the corpus callosum is in the shape of a C. So it is this red part here that you see in the middle. And another cool thing is you can see that it separates. So I'm just waiting for this to be in the right position. But it actually separates the left and half hemisphere of your brain. So at a certain angle you can see that it is right in the middle, and it actually separates the left and half hemisphere of your brain. So this is a connective pathway, and it is made up of a lot, 200 million nerve fibers. Right, so that is something that you need to be able to identify and just sort of know that it is a connective pathway, and it also separates your left and right hemisphere. So there we get that function. It separates and connects these two hemispheres from one another. It also coordinates the messages sent between these two hemispheres, and it will also transfer information. Alright, so next up is the cerebellum.
Okay, the cerebellum is right at, I usually say if you put your hand here at the back, and that's when you're touching your cerebellum, it's right at the base of your skull. It is actually small in comparison to your cerebrum. It's not that large, but let's quickly look at it's also actually divided into two hemispheres, but that is just for enrichment. So the cerebellum is found at the base of your skull. It is connected by a structure that we call the vermis, but that is not in your syllabus. It's just for you to know that there's actually a connection between the left and the right hemisphere of the cerebellum as well, and that it has a very similar structure to the cerebrum, okay? Interestingly enough, it also has gray and white matter, and it actually is arranged in the shape of a tree. So it's also called the arbor of life, because if you have a cross-section of the cerebellum, it looks like a tree growing. So you have this white and gray matter forming this pattern that is very, very recognizable. And then we see here that the gray matter, which is now my cell bodies, is located on the surface of the cerebellum, so on the outside, and the white matter is located on the inside, forming a tree-like structure. Okay, so what is the functions of the cerebellum? And these are the ones that usually gives us trouble, because then they get confused with the ones that comes from the cerebrum. I think corpus callosum is easy. It's a connection. It's a pathway. But when we get to the cerebrum and the cerebellum, they are so interconnected that they do sound similar. Okay, so the first one that is important, it is part of maintaining balance. And when you do the ear, you will actually refer back to that one. Maintaining your balance, your posture, keeping you upright. So it is that small muscle twitches that helps you to actually be able to sit up straight and not fall over. Okay. Then coordination of movement. I usually say, if you look at a baby, when they start to drink from a sippy cup, when they drink from a sippy cup, they will take the cup and they will immediately tilt it right over their head. So if you give them water in a glass like this, they will dump all the water over their face. But with time, they actually learn that you can't do that with a glass like this. And that is the coordination, that muscle memory, that muscle movement, that smaller, finer detail, so that the glass actually, that you don't touch the glass too hard, you just touch it hard enough, and you take it up to your mouth and you know where to stop. That is the coordination that we are referring to here, and not necessarily just the different muscles coordinating, but how much pressure must be applied for you to actually lift up the glass. Okay, then vision, it is actually that coordination of hand-eye coordination. So the vision, your eye is observing and it is coordinating the muscle movement that goes with that vision. So it's not actually seeing, it is what you are seeing and the muscle that goes with that vision. I must have maybe used another word there, but it is the coordination, and as well as your two eyes moving together. Okay, you don't have one eye going that way and the other eye going that way. Your eyes will move like a pair, okay, so that they can see the same thing. Okay, and then motor learning, we have talked about that. That is the little glass you pick up and coordinating that movement. Okay, but the two easiest ones to remember is the first two. So maintaining balance and the coordination of movement. Okay, so this is an important terminology, and I made a separate slide for it specifically. It's yours.
All right. So we have this this part called the foramen magnum, and this is specifically not that red part that extends. The foramen magnum is the hole. Right, so it's the hole at the back of the skull, and this is the hole through which the medulla oblongata and then the spinal cord will rise from. So specifically that hole, and this is important for when we look at evolution, is that foramen magnum, when we have quadrupedal organisms, organisms like apes walking on 4 legs, knuckle walkers, their foramen magnum will be more to the back of their skull, and in bipedal animals like us walking on 2 legs, our foramen magnum will be more to the front of the skull. Right, so extending from that foramen magnum, the whole, we now have the medulla oblongata. Quite important that you include both of these words, not just medulla, not just oblongata, it is the medulla oblongata. So this is that first part there that you see extending, and this part is quite essential for life. So this is the part that manages your heart rate, it manages your breathing rate, it manages your circulation. So if for some other reason you have damage to the medulla oblongata, you will most probably be placed on some type of a heart monitor or a breathing monitor or a ventilator, because you cannot breathe by your own, your heart cannot beat on its own. So to identify where we find that, you'll see this sort of large swelling underneath, which we indicated by that green part. You don't need to be able to identify it, but it is called the pons. And just below that swelling, we have the structure known as the medulla oblongata. Right. It also does some of these automatic responses, which like coughing and sneezing and swallowing and vomiting. So the medulla oblongata also regulates that, and it also connects some of your nerves. So the nerves will enter through the medulla oblongata going to the brain, and then also leave the brain by going out by the medulla oblongata. All right. So then we are moving back to the spinal cord.
Okay, the spinal cord, it's such, on that picture or that diagram, is such a small part of the brain actually. If you go see here, it's just that little red tip here at the bottom. It is important when you label, when they ask you in the exam to label the brain, that you be very careful for which one is the medulla oblongata and which one is the spinal cord, okay? Learners do get those two confused. Okay, the spinal cord will always be at the bottom, okay, so right here at the bottom, and then the medulla will be in the middle section. So that is important to realize. And then so if we go look at the spinal cord, it's a cylindrical structure that connects your brain, or is connected to your brain. It goes through the foramen magnum down into your vertebral column. Okay, and what is the functions of the spinal cord? And this is where it is important. It is obviously a place where we carry signals to and from the brain, but the one that is really important here is that one, the reflex center. So this is kind of what I call a rudimentary evolutionary thing we have. We are able to protect our body without even thinking, without using our brains. So the information will get to the spinal cord and it will immediately leave again. It will send a message to the brain, but you would have reacted long after you actually have received that message. So this is an evolutionary thing we have so that we can protect our body. And that's why it's really difficult to actually, if you really get a fright, you cannot help your reaction. You will react regardless, because before you actually can think about it, you've already reacted. And that is interesting. They actually did a study with American Army people where they teach them to suppress their reflex action. Okay, and then connects, it's a connection point for the cranial and the spinal nerves, and then it connects the body to the brain. Okay, so here is how it looks. So this is, you can see that it forms a long column and that it is almost like an oval shape. And we can see that there is nerves connected to the spinal cord, okay? What we do see here is that the one with the little bubble inside it, well, there is I actually have added there, is called a ganglion, and that is how we identify the sensory neuron. The one with the little bubble is the sensory neuron, and the one that is just smooth, that one will be the motor neuron leaving the spinal cord. So the impulse will come in at the top and it will leave at the bottom in this picture. Okay, that is important to say, because I can inverse the picture as well if I want to. Okay, so that is then my sensory neuron coming in. Okay, we call that connection of the nerve to the spinal cord, we call the dorsal root. Okay, and then the connection of the motor neuron is known as the ventral root. Okay, now we're going to look at the inside of the spinal cord. Okay, so we're going to see there where the dorsal root comes in. It connects to a little H shape of gray matter, and this is different from the brain. In the brain, remember that the gray matter was on the outside and the white matter was on the inside, but here it's different. So the gray matter is here on the inside and the white matter is on the outside, and the gray matter is in this shape of a little H, okay, and the top part of the H is known as the dorsal horn, okay, and then the bottom part of the H, or the butterfly, is known as the ventral horn. I remember it usually because there's a little wider side here. This looks like a V, upside down V. So that is for a ventral side, and there at the top is no V, so that is the dorsal side, like a D that's round. Okay, so that is how I know that that is the dorsal side, and this side with the little like a lippy in, that is my ventral side. So that will be my dorsal root with my dorsal horn, and this will be my ventral horn, and the nerve that leaves here will be the ventral root. Okay, so that is what I just indicated there. So that is my white matter and my gray matter, and then we have a little question for you.
All right. So a little reading that we're quickly going to do together. In 2002, a former American football player was found dead in his truck. The doctor who handled the autopsy discovered that the football player had severe brain damage and that his death was caused by repeated blows to the head or repeated concussions. And then he called this disorder chronic traumatic something encephalopathy, or I'm just going to call it CTE. And a more recent study was conducted which involved the brains of 165 people who played football at high school or college, and the study found evidence of this disease in 131 of the brains. So 131 out of 165 shows me that there's, with contact sports, quite often you will get some concussions. Right, so a few questions that they are asking. The part of the brain affected by CTE is the cerebrum. What are two possible symptoms of this disorder? So this is a trick way for them to they don't list the symptoms really in the reading. They are actually just wanting you to give them the functions of the cerebrum. So if you know the functions of the cerebrum, then you know those things won't be able to occur if the cerebrum is damaged. So there will be some loss of their thought processes. So you could maybe say loss of memory, loss of judgment, maybe problems solving some problems. They might lose some of their senses, maybe loss of smell, loss of hearing, loss of sight even, and then loss of some voluntary actions. So things like not being able to move their leg, not being able to pick up a stick, right? So anything practical, any two of those, they are just wanting to know if you know what the cerebrum does. Next one. What is one way in which the brain is protected? So we had quite a nice view of how the brain is protected. Any one of these would be fine. The skull or the cranium would be a bit more of a proper answer. Then the meninges. You don't need to know the names of the meninges, just meninges. And then that fluid, the cerebrospinal fluid. Any one of those three will then protect the brain. The next one, we have an explain question. So with an explain, we can see that it's 2 marks and you have to give a cause and an effect. So explain why CTE does not affect essential life processes. So those would include heart rate, breathing rate, things that are essential for you to be alive. So why doesn't it not affect those processes? And that is because it only affects the cerebrum. And if it would have affected the medulla oblongata, then it would have caused problems with the essential life processes. So the medulla is perfectly fine, and the medulla can still regulate breathing and still regulate heart rate, and therefore it's not damaged. It's only the cerebrum that is damaged. All right, and then we get to our last part of the day, looking at the reflex arc.
Yes. Okay, firstly, before we continue, I have to give a disclaimer, There's a difference between a reflex arc and a reflex action, okay? Reflex arc is the physical pathway that the impulse will travel through the different neurons. So it will go through the sensory neuron to the brain, and then motor neuron to the muscle, okay? That pathway, the physical pathway, if I jump on the N2 here and I drive to Cape Town, that is the path I'm driving on the N2. That is physical. That is a reflex arc, okay? But the action, if you hit a ball at me and I do this, that is called a reflex action, okay? So be careful, because they are very pedantic when they ask this in the terminology. I didn't include it in the slides, I just remembered. Okay, so when we have a reflex arc, we start with a stimulus, okay? So the eye or a receptor will see that there's trouble, okay? That will then generate an impulse, which is then conducted with a sensory neuron. Now, normally, it will go to the brain if it's just normal information. For instance, me reading on the slide what is happening there, that information is going to the brain. The brain is going to think about it, and it is going to send a message to the muscle. Okay, so that is the normal pathway where there is decision making or a conscious thought being processed. When I, for instance, put my finger on a hot plate or touch a candle or whatever, there's various different examples. Okay, now I have my skin as the receptor. It will generate an impulse, and now that impulse is going to go to the spinal cord, and it's going to miss the brain. It's going to go directly back to the muscle for you to actually pull away your hand. So it is like a short circuit, okay? It's jumping the brain and reacting so that it can protect the body.
I also tell my learners that is why you only feel the pain
After
you just touch the hot plate. You don't feel your hand being, burned
Burning.
and warm and whatever. It's because the brain is only led into that decision, or not decision, the brain is only notified a bit later.
Yeah.
After you've responded, the brain sort of gets notified, and then you'll feel the pain.
Okay, so I included that specific picture so that you can see that we aren't actually going to the brain. Okay, so what is important is that you have to be able to label this diagram, okay? You don't need to draw it, it's a bit complicated, but you do need to be able to label it, okay? And what I like to do is I like to label it, and then I like to put the function of each label next to it. So that way I know that is actually then the story of my pathway, because if I know the function of each one of those labels, I can tell the little story that I need to be able to tell, because you have to be able to discuss a reflex action in a paragraph.
Yeah, it's like a 5-mark question.
Yeah.
Very easily.
Yeah, so it's easily, and they always ask it. You can go through various papers, this will be there. Okay, so the first thing, what does the receptor do? The receptor is reacting to a stimulus, okay? So the stimulus will convert the receptor will convert the stimulus into an impulse, okay? What is now going to happen with that impulse, okay? It has to go to the brain, so I need a road for it to be able to travel to the central nervous system. And we know that road is called the sensory neuron. So the impulse is transported from the receptor to the central nervous system via the sensory neuron, okay? So what happens now? Now it's inside my spinal cord, okay? And now it is forming a connection here with another neuron. We call that connection where two neurons meet. Remember, they do not physically connect. We call it a functional connection. There are actually little gaps in between. We call this a synapse, okay? I have actually included it there. Okay, I forgot the, okay, so that is my synapse, okay? So now that impulse is then carried over to the connector neuron or the interneuron, which is the green neuron, okay? So that is then transmitted to the next neuron. And from there, it will be directly transmitted to the motor neuron, which is now going to go back to the body to protect it. Okay, so that is the pathway it's going to follow to protect the body. So it's going to go down the motor neuron back to the effector, which is then the muscle. We can also call the sensor neuron the afferent neuron. Okay, it's going to the body. And then the effector we can call the efferent neuron. That is also two different ways that they can refer to the different neurons. Afferent, always, Afrikaans is easier because afferent and na is two A's, and efferent and weg is two E's, but in English there's no such shortcuts. Okay, so this is really important. So there's actually quite a few questions of this, but let's start with this one. This is a multiple choice question. The last question, and they ask with parts labeled 1 and 2 respectively, and the reason why I specifically refer to efferent and afferent because it was in this question. So you actually have to know what the difference is, and the answer here is then the last one. I'm not going to have time to explain, but the answer is the dendrite of the afferent neuron and the axon of the efferent neuron.
All right, so grade 12s, thank you for watching our lesson. I hope that you've learned a lot, and we look forward to seeing you again next time.
Yes, good day. Have a lovely week, and I will see you when we do the endocrine system.
Goodbye. Have a good afternoon.
Bye-bye, guys.